My phone's falling. I had the best day. Just the best. Nico?
Across much of America's right-leaning audience, the reaction to the star of this movie has been overwhelmingly hostile. Rachel Zegler is described as bitter, angry, and unlikable, with critics arguing that if she doesn't even seem to enjoy or respect her own character, it's no surprise audiences see her as insufferable. Instead of playing Snow White with warmth, she came off to them like a whiny brat. And yet, in her own words, Rachel insisted she was not ungrateful for the career opportunities she'd been given. She admitted she could be living through incredible, once-in-a-lifetime moments, while at the same time wishing desperately that people would stop sending her death threats. Hoping to steady the ship and turn the tide, she posted what was meant to be a heartfelt video. But instead of calming the chaos, it backfired spectacularly. The clip, filmed from what looked like her own bedroom, showed Rachel staring directly into the camera, her face shifting between raw vulnerability and sharp defiance. She told viewers that even through all the negativity, people were still lining up to support her work. Her voice quivered between tearful sincerity and a defensive edge as she stood firmly by her performance and accused online haters of fueling unnecessary toxicity that had shadowed the film since day one. At one point, she compared herself to the winged victory of Samothrace, the ancient statue now housed in the Louvre that arrived in pieces yet still commands admiration. Rachel said that, like that sculpture, she too was cracked, flawed, and imperfect, but hoped people would still show up, still wait in line to see her. Then came the line that sealed the moment. If anyone disagreed with her message, they could simply unfollow because she didn't need their business. It was part plea, part declaration, and part act of pride, a final attempt to seize control of the narrative. But the internet is rarely forgiving, and within minutes, clips of the video were being clipped, memed, and stitched across TikTok. Reaction after reaction poured in. Some were sarcastic, others comedic, and many openly mocking. Content creators exaggerated her tone, made parody skits about her curtains in the background, and slammed her words as tone-deaf entitlement. Instead of creating sympathy, the video gave her critics new ammunition. By the end of the day, the hashtag #WarkSnowFlop was trending, with countless voices chiming in that the movie's failure was inevitable. Audiences argued Disney had made a fatal mistake by casting someone who seemed, to them, completely disconnected from ordinary people. A star they called out of touch, self-centered, and widely disliked within her own industry. To them, Rachel wasn't just a poor choice for Snow White. She had become the face of Hollywood's arrogance. Even Gal Gadot, who played the evil queen, couldn't shift the narrative. What was supposed to be a magical comeback for one of Disney's most iconic stories had turned into a digital witch trial. And in the eyes of critics, the villain wasn't the evil queen. It was Rachel herself. The piling on only intensified as commentators across podcasts, YouTube shows, and social media accused Rachel of being woke in a way that's deranged. They painted her as unstable, unhappy, and disguising personal turmoil as political statements about feminism, patriarchy, and abortion. Influencers told their audiences to boycott the film, warning parents not to take their kids no matter how much they loved the classic tale. Making matters worse, older press interviews resurfaced, the ones where Rachel dismissed the 1937 Snow White as weird and creepy, rolling her eyes at the romance between Snow White and the prince, and calling it outdated. Those clips, which may have seemed cheeky at the time, now aged like spoiled milk. They only reinforced the belief among critics and audiences alike that she had no respect for the role or the legacy of the original film. The backlash was relentless. What should have been a fairy tale triumph had instead turned into a cultural firestorm. Disney had gambled on Rachel Zegler as the face of its new Snow White, but the gamble had backfired, leaving her not as the heroine of the story, but as the lightning rod for its collapse. The original Snow White cartoon came out in 1937, and it shows, visually, stylistically, and thematically. The story placed heavy emphasis on a love story with a prince who, by modern standards, comes across more like a stalker than a romantic hero. Rachel Zegler herself had mocked this, calling it weird and outdated. Yet despite dismissing the original, she also admitted that she had elbowed her way to the front of the line for the part. From the very beginning, she made it clear that her version of Snow White would be radically different. Rachel openly said that people might assume it was a love story simply because a male character was cast, but she hinted that Andrew Burnap, the actor playing the prince, might see most or all of his scenes cut. Who knows? It's Hollywood, baby, she quipped. She then doubled down, saying that if she was going to stand around in an iconic Disney princess dress for 18 hours a day, she deserved to be paid for every hour the film was streamed online. To her, this Snow White wasn't about dreaming of true love or waiting for rescue. It was about a woman determined to become a leader, independent of the prince altogether. But when the film finally opened, the numbers were catastrophic. Snow White brought in just $45 million on opening weekend, a figure that might have been respectable for a small indie production. But for Disney, a company banking on the prestige of its legacy princess brand, it was a humiliating disaster. The contrast with The Little Mermaid was staggering. Despite its own controversies, that film opened at $95 million. Snow White making less than half that amount was a glaring signal that something had gone very wrong. Behind the scenes, the situation was no less chaotic. Reports surfaced that Disney had been in a quiet panic over Rachel Zegler for years. Executives allegedly begged her to keep her messaging safe and on brand, even orchestrating tweets celebrating her excitement for the role. One such post garnered millions of views, and the studio congratulated her on the positive reception. Until minutes later, she followed it up with a blunt political message. Never forget Free Palestine. Disney executives scrambled, even flying out a producer to meet Rachel in person. They tried to convince her that while she was entitled to her personal beliefs, publicly tying them to Snow White could alienate the audience. They suggested she keep such statements private, maybe share them with close friends, rather than the world. But Rachel refused to delete the tweet. The fallout forced Disney to hire a special media consultant tasked solely with monitoring her social media presence, trying to keep her from generating further controversy. By then, the perception was already cemented. Online audiences didn't just ignore Snow White, they actively worked to drag it down. The film plummeted on IMDb, crashing to a 1/6 score and earning the unenviable title of lowest-rated movie in the platform's history. This wasn't merely box office failure, it was cinematic infamy. Cinematic infamy.
I kept falling asleep intermittently for like an hour at a time. So it's 9 now. I don't know what I'm gonna do. I think I'm just gonna
At what should have been a moment of triumph, Rachel and her co-star Gal Gadot walked the red carpet together. But even there, the tension was palpable. On stage, the two were introduced with the usual fanfare, but the energy felt strained, the applause muted. The promotional segments, meant to showcase the film's visual magic and Disney's signature wonder, rang hollow against the backdrop of the disaster unfolding. And then came the cultural backlash. Political commentators picked up the story, dissecting Snow White not just as a commercial flop, but as a loaded piece of cultural messaging. To them, this was no longer about whether the CGI was convincing or whether the script worked. It was about ideology, Hollywood arrogance, and the perceived rewriting of beloved classics to satisfy agendas rather than audiences. What had started as a modern retelling of a fairy tale had spiraled into something far larger, a battlefield in America's ongoing culture wars. Then came the next and perhaps most devastating wave of criticism. Accusations that Snow White wasn't just a failed film, but one deliberately loaded with political messaging. Almost overnight, the phrase communist undertones began appearing in reviews, YouTube breakdowns, and Reddit threads, spreading across the internet like wildfire. The discussions were no longer about whether Rachel Zegler was miscast or whether the CGI looked unfinished. They had shifted into debates about ideology. Content creators began dissecting the story frame by frame. One viral commentator summed it up bluntly. "All right, guys, I watched Snow White, so you don't have to. Let's get into it." He explained how in this reimagined version, Snow White doesn't get her name from the fairness of her skin, as in the classic tale, but from surviving a snowstorm. Her parents, the king and queen, rule not over a traditional kingdom, but over what the film presents as a utopian collective society. Here, resources are shared equally, and fairness is defined by distribution rather than beauty. Snow White is described as the fairest of them all, not because of her looks, but because she represents this ideal of equality. To some, this was harmless world-building, an attempt to modernize a dated fairy tale. But to others, especially conservative critics, it was a blatant attempt to reprogram a children's story with political dogma. They argued that Disney had stripped away the timeless themes of love, virtue, and morality, replacing them with heavy-handed messages about wealth redistribution and collectivist values. What was once a lighthearted fantasy about kindness and dreams was now, in their eyes, a lecture disguised as entertainment. And the critique didn't stop at the script. Cultural commentators accuse Disney of turning Snow White into a vehicle for propaganda, embedding anti-royalty and anti-traditional values in a story meant to enchant families. Parents who grew up on the original 1937 classic complained that the remake had abandoned its fairy tale DNA, trading innocence for ideology. Online debates flared, with some mocking the film as snow woke, while others warned that Hollywood had gone too far in politicizing children's media. For Rachel Zegler, the backlash was personal. All the goodwill she had once enjoyed from West Side Story evaporated almost overnight. Where her confidence had once been praised as refreshing, it was now read as arrogance. Her attempts to frame her Snow White as an independent leader rather than a love-struck girl came across to many as disrespectful to the original story, and by extension, to the generations who cherished it. The more she defended her vision, the harsher the response became. The cultural conversation shifted from the movie itself to Rachel as a person. She became the lightning rod for every frustration audiences had with Disney's direction. Memes ridiculed her interviews, reaction videos mocked her serious tone, and political pundits held her up as proof of Hollywood's out-of-touch elite. What was meant to be her crowning role as a Disney princess had instead placed her at the center of a cultural firestorm. Her effort to reclaim the story, to steer the narrative back in her favor, backfired spectacularly. Every video she posted, every quote she gave was dissected, clipped, and weaponized against her. And while Disney had hoped to ride her star power into a new era of princess films, the gamble collapsed under the weight of public opinion. What was supposed to be Rachel Zegler's breakout leading role, the one that would cement her as a household name, had instead become the very project that fractured her public image, divided audiences, and perhaps permanently altered the trajectory of her career. Snow White wasn't just another box office disappointment. For many, it was the symbol of an industry losing touch with its audience, and Rachel had, fairly or unfairly, become its face.